Hi, this is Sarah Strong. This presentation shows the action research I've been working on for Lesley University. My topic and title is Effective Strategies for Teaching Mathematical Word Problem Solving to ELL Students. My research question specifically is what strategies are effective for teaching English language learners math word problem solving skills. I chose this topic because ELLs in my math intervention class have shown difficulty when trying to solve word problems, whether it's based on the language of the word problem. They also don't seem to have many strategies for working on challenging problems. Through the research, I found that the achievement gap between non-ELLs and ELLs on state testing measures, which typically include quite a few word problems, that achievement gap increases from grade 4 to grade 8. So this is a relevant topic for middle schoolers. The three strategies I have investigated are basic strategy instruction, bar model drawing, and schematic instruction with culturally and linguistically responsive teaching practices. The research showed that the greater the linguistic complexity of a word problem, the greater the achievement gap between ELLs and non-ELLs. So linguistic complexity includes sentence length, the inclusion of subordinate clauses, and difficult academic or technical vocabulary. The same research also by Martin Yellow showed that when a schematic diagram, so a diagram that shows conceptual information, not a pictorial diagram, when this type of diagram is included on a word problem, that ELL students are more likely to answer it correctly, even if the problem is linguistically complex. Other research showed that basic strategy instruction, so teaching students skills for understanding a problem, teaching them to devise a plan, and then execute their plan, that this type of instruction has helped ELL students. And bar model drawing has been shown, which is also sometimes called tape diagrams. It's a problem-solving skill that students with mathematics difficulty have used and improved their problem-solving skills with. Lastly, another piece of research that I found important was that ELL students have demonstrated improvement in word problem solving after receiving schematic instruction, which teaches students to identify the problem type, such as a ratio and proportion problem or a probability problem. And using this type of instruction with culturally and linguistically responsive teaching practices, like allowing students to use their native language, or incorporating student interest and student background into teaching, that ELL students improved problem-solving abilities. So for my study, I focused on the action research process by starting off with a problem or question that's really relevant to my teaching and my students in my classroom. I looked at what others had done in order to create a plan, but reflected often while executing this plan, and sometimes had to change the plan based on the dynamic teaching environment. The participants in my study include my 7th and 8th grade math intervention class students. All the students in the study are ELL students. I was able to collect data from 7 students. All of the students had performed below the 20th percentile on district math assessments the year prior, so that's partially why they were in the intervention class. Of the ELL students, 4 of them are LEP students, limited English proficient students, and 3 of them are FEP students, fluent English proficient students. And so LEP students have not quite passed our state language assessment, the WEDA. FEP students have passed it within the past 2 years, so they are not quite exited from the ELL program. They're being monitored to make sure that language acquisition is still not significantly challenging their academic progress. The participants included 6 boys and 1 girl. All the participants are are Latino students from Spanish-speaking families. To collect data for my study, I wanted to include different perspectives from all of the different participants in the study. So I looked at student work samples. I looked at the pretest that I gave at the beginning of the study, and then each intervention strategy, there was a post-test after all 3 interventions. I also included teacher observations while teaching or assessing, and field notes after each session, including my reflections. Also, the 7th grade math teacher was a critical friend during this action research project. He looked at my pre-tests and post-tests with me to make sure they were grade level appropriate, and he also performed an observation during the second intervention strategy. And lastly, I gave students a survey at the end after the third post-test, asking them to rate whether they had improved, select the strategy that seemed the most helpful, and write down what skills they plan to use in future word problem solving. So for the entire process, I started off with a pre-test, and then we moved into basic strategy instruction. So for 3 days, I taught them the RISE strategy. So this is an acronym for that gave students steps for word problem solving. And we made this anchor chart on the first day. So the RISE strategy encourages students to reread a problem, read it at least twice, underline or circle important information, illustrate the problem by making a diagram. And for this intervention, we focused on making charts, and solve the problem and use tools available like calculators or multiplication charts to check their work. And a simple explanation of their problem. For this, I just asked them to write at least a sentence including their answer. Here's an example of student work from this strategy, utilizing all of the steps of the RISE process. So after 3 days, 2 43-minute periods and 1 80-minute period of instruction, students were given the post-test, and then we moved on to the bar model drawing, where we followed a similar format. Students made a note sheet on the topic of bar model drawing, and then the rest of instruction focused on solving word problems together through guided practice or through partner practice. I encouraged collaboration and roved around the classroom answering questions or supporting students. During the second intervention, the critical friend also did an observation. And on the 4th day, the students were given a post-test before we moved on to schematic instruction with culturally linguistically responsive teaching. So because of my reflections were showing that the students seemed a bit tired of just looking at word problems most of the class period, I organized this intervention a bit differently. I included stations with hands-on materials like mixing lemonade powder and water and trail mix proportions. And I incorporated interest-based topics like soccer. Many of the students in class enjoy watching and playing soccer. I also spent a day focusing on the language of word problems, so looking at common phrases and vocabulary in word problems and how understanding those words and phrases can help them decide on what type of problem it is and then create a plan for solving it. And then students were given the third post-test before they took the student survey. Students were given the following survey after the third post-test, as I mentioned, gathering information from their perspective of the learning process. So to analyze the data I had collected, I started with the student work samples. I looked at each problem to determine whether it was accurately solved. On the post-test, whether the students used the strategy, and if there were any computation errors that impeded accuracy, and whether or not the students chose relevant information for solving the problem. So here's a graph showing how the students did. You can see that here's the pre-test. And so overall, students improved their ability to answer questions correctly quite a bit. And also I found this information important, that this is the percentage of problems using the targeted strategy. So students definitely use the RISE strategy as well as the bar model strategy quite a bit for problem solving. I also looked at my field notes and observations, and the observation from the 7th grade math teacher. I reread and coded them based on different categories like student engagement during the learning process and assessment process, and issues of language such as confusing phrasing or language cues that seem to help students in problem solving. And I organized all of those notes by breaking them into the different strategies, but I also looked at them as a whole for overall reflections on the intervention process. And I also looked at the student surveys to determine whether or not students believed they had improved or which strategy seemed most helpful, and then the written down open-ended response of what skills they'll carry forward. So my findings show that I don't think I was able to determine which strategy was most effective. I think, as you can see from this graph, every student showed quite a bit of improvement. And I think that some of that is just a 4-week period of focusing on ratio and proportion word problems. And so they became more comfortable with the topic and improved their problem solving. And I think each strategy has benefits that ELL students can use. So I propose in a moment sharing each strategy in different formats. The students themselves, they felt like overall most of them believed that they improved, and they selected both the bar model drawing and the RISE strategy as the most helpful. This word splash was created from the open-ended response, and what it says to me is I feel like students gained an attention to word problems, particularly in the reading and rereading of the problem. Cueing into important information and underlining and encircling information is a skill many of them wrote down, so I believe it will be. So I think the skill of rereading the problem and focusing on important information will be carried forward. Also, my notes showed that I felt like students were most engaged and interested in learning during the schematic instruction with culturally and linguistically responsive teaching. So from all of these forms of data, I feel like students will benefit from all 3 strategies to improve their performance on word problems. I plan on sharing basic strategy instruction with the math team, the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math teachers. I think that all students could benefit from following something like the RISE acronym for cueing into the different steps of problem solving. I plan on sharing the bar model drawing with the intervention team. I felt like this strategy needed more time for students to master, and so this might be applicable in the intervention classroom. Also, many students who struggle with math benefit from using diagramming as a problem-solving technique. And the schematic instruction with culturally linguistically responsive teaching, I plan on sharing this with the math team as well, but I will present this as an opportunity for me as the ELL teacher to co-teach or co-plan with a math teacher. So the teacher would pick a unit and we would try to incorporate student interest and student background into the learning process, and maybe focus on language acquisition a little bit more closely. So my reflections on the overall process and future questions. Reflections include thinking about the limitations. So the sample size, there were only 7 students in the study. Also, I should note the cultural and socioeconomic differences between the participants and myself. So all the students are Latino. Students from Spanish-speaking families, their families are all low-income families. And I am a middle-class white female teacher. And so I feel like those cultural and socioeconomic differences could have played a role in our the relationship between teacher and student. However, I have worked with all these students for a year and a half, so I've known them for a while and have developed good teaching relationships with all of them. All of the students, as I mentioned, are Spanish-speaking students from Mexico, so it's not necessarily a limitation, but it's a consideration that maybe this research isn't applicable to all ELL students. My future questions, I'd like to look more closely at linguistic complexity, how to break down word problems and difficult phrases for student understanding. I'd also like to look at different ways of encouraging collaboration in math and what forms of collaboration are most effective. And specifically, when talking about collaboration, helping students justify and explain their thinking in math instruction. Those are some topics that I'd like to explore further after doing this action research process. Overall, the process was really informative, and I plan on following this process with future questions and problems that arise in the classroom.